Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's class. Today we'll be looking at creating API routes in NextJs. Last time we were assessing external API routes, that is backend and external backend, a free external backend. So today we are going to see how we can create our own API routes within our NextJs application. First, it will be important that we note that creating API routes in the page directory structure is different from creating API routes in the app directory structure. Okay, so basically, let's just get right to it so that. Okay, so let's just get right to it. So basically, let me just create our API folder. Okay, and we can go ahead and create a folder for users, and then let's create an index. Okay, so basically this is the page structure, right? So as you can see, we are going to be accessing this user API through the API route, the user directory, and then we can access the route. Now, what I want you to understand is that when creating APIs inside of the pages structure, uh, we can utilize one handler and have all our methods written within that handler, right? So each function or each export, we can have a default export for each handler. Now that handler can handle everything because we are using the request and REST and response method or response style, typically for Node.js API creation. Yeah. So basically it supports all HTTP methods in one function. So if we are creating a route here now, let's say we say export. So as you can see, we are going to be exporting only one default function. Okay. We're going to be exporting only one default function and call it handler. We're going to have the rest and then request and response. Okay. All right. So the export. All right. So please do well to let me know if you are not following. Just write in the text box. Don't wait until I ask if you're following. If you're not following, just write in the text box or raise your hand up, and then we can take questions. Okay, so that everybody follows along. So now if request, now you can see that we are now defining our request methods within the handler. Okay. So we're saying if it's a get request, we want to handle it in a particular way. We want to handle it like this. So we want to return the response, the status of 200. Okay. Then we want to pass the JSON of user. Good. So now these users is the array of users that we are going to define, right? So I just want us to see what it looks like. So now we can actually define another method within this handler and call this method a post method, right? I call this method a post method. Now, if you notice, you see that we have don't have too much errors. So you see that we have one method defined here, and then we have another method defined here within our handler, right? Now, if you want to work with the page, that's sorry, the app directory structure, right? For the app directory structure, each file must export named handlers. So in the app directory structure, you cannot export this handler like this. You cannot export one handler, one default handler, and then pass uh, your request methods within or request logic within that handler. You have to create your handler separately. So you do something like export async function get. So can you still see the screen? Is it okay now? Josh, Udo, can you see the screen now? Is it clear? Is it still moving or is it still stuck? Is anybody experiencing this apart from Josh and Udo? All right, can you all hear me now? Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen, please, so we can continue. All right, okay. So I believe you understood to this point, right? Are we good? Can we move on? Okay, so what I was saying is in the app, so let me just do this. So let's call this pages method. And then let's call this app method. So as you can see, like I said, when using the pages structure, you can define your API routes in one handler. Okay. So as you can see now, I have defined a get request, a get route, and also a post route, right? Inside the same page, inside the same file, right? And then I have a singular default export, default function handler export, right? So now what happens is when we access this route, we can actually access this route and access each of these route methods independently within this route. Now, for us to do the same thing in the app method, we have to export each handler separately. Okay. So you can see that now I'm exporting get request separately. If I want to have uh, a post request, I will do the same thing. I will have to export. I have to export async function post. Okay. Okay. So now this is how we handle it, our routes, how we create our define our routes in or our methods inside our routes in the app uh, structure. And then in the page structure, we utilize one handler to define all our methods within. Okay. So let's go ahead and see all this in action. All right. So I will remove this for now. So firstly, before we start, let's set up a library folder where having, we will place our data. Okay. And then we want to have a folder called called data. Then within that folder, we want to have users. So what we're doing here is just create a dummy data like we did in our last class. So we just have, let's call it users, export users, and equals to, so we should have an ID, still one, and then name, say John Doe, and then let's have email. Okay. John at gmail.com. Okay, so we have, let's try to have 3 rows of data. So let's try to have 3 rows of data. And let's have, okay. All right. So we can work with this. All right. So now that we have our user array created, we can now go ahead and set up our EMV environment. Okay. So what do you guys know, or what comes to your mind when you hear EMV? Someone should speak, please. What comes to mind? Udo. All right, can you hear me? What comes to mind? What comes to mind when you hear EMV? That is environment. What comes to mind? Okay, so basically, the EMV file, the file that had secrets. Okay, all right, that works. So the file is used to store environment variables. Okay, so for each API, you want to be able to expose a particular URL to as a base URL to run whatever application you are running, right? And there are different environments. You might have a development environment uh, or a production environment, depending on what you are doing. For each of those environments, you want to have a location where you should be able to um, expose those URLs to your browser, right? So what it does is it allows you to define variables that can be accessed in both server-side and client-side code, okay? Now, what we are going to be using in this particular case is next public base URL. And for this base URL, we'll be using HTTP localhost because at the moment our application is being hosted on localhost server, yeah? So we want a situation where since we are defining our APIs from the front end, from the application directly here, basically what's going to happen is it's going to be running this local host that we are running this server on, 300, will serve as our back-end base URL. Okay. So now that we have this URL defined, we can now go ahead and Hold on. All right, we can now go ahead and utilize that, okay? So let's let's set up our first API, and that will be users, okay? Are we following so far? So within this users route, we want to have a get request and also have a post request, okay? So the get request should serve as a route to get the user's information, that is the user's array, okay? And then the post request should serve as a route to create a user, correct? Now let's go on. So like I said, we'll export in one handler. So we say default function handler request and response. So now we can go ahead and let's add an exception so that if there is no user data, we can serve a particular. So let's import users. So remember, these users, we're importing it from our data library that we created, okay? So it's like a demo, a default sort of database that we have designed here, okay? So let's continue. So for this, we want to say if user is false, we want to return res.status 404. And then we want to pass JSON and then pass a message saying no user was found. Okay, so now if you are familiar with using applications, you see that there are sometimes you make an API call and you get this kind of response. So what we are doing now is we are trying to make sure that when the user is using the application, if they have failure when API calls have been made, they should be able to be led to understand why that failure occurred, right? So we're adding all these exceptions to ensure that they can tell when the users are available or when the users are not available, right? Or when there's data or when there's no data. You can also utilize this to set up your error handling on the front end, okay? So let's say if request the method is equals to get is equals to get, we want to return our user information. So we want to say response or status first should be 200, so it's successful. And then we want to pass our users as a JSON file. Okay. Now we have our get request written out, okay? Let's handle our post request. So we say if request dot method is post. All right. We want to const And from our request body, we want to pick the name and email. Okay. All right. Now, when we have this, we can now prompt new user. And then for new user, we want to give that new user an ID, right? Because when the user is created, you should have a default ID, okay? So for this ID, we are going to utilize the date.noun so that we can create unique IDs, okay? Date.noun dot to string. Okay. And then we also want to pass the name and the email. Now, for us to attach that user to the user array, we can now push new user to the array, okay? Now let's return our response, okay? So let's say our response for this is status of 201. And for this status, we now pass JSON new user. All right. Now, remember that, hold on. Remember that at this stage now, you still want to return a scenario where there is probably a wrong method. So assuming you, instead of using the post, you use a put, or instead of using a get, you use a delete. In this particular route, it should not work, right? So you want to say if the response or status, return response or status of 405, and then we want to send a message to the user saying that method is not allowed. Okay, are we together so far? So basically what we've done is create a handler that handles a get request and also handles a post request. So yeah, so basically what's going to happen in this scenario now is that when we are making our API call, we can access this particular route. Yeah, so I said something like that in the last class. Try to do your own research because we might not get so deep into defining each error, each status code. Okay, but 200 is always for success and 2012. Okay, so yeah, 4042 is always for user not found. Okay, all right. But you can still go ahead and understand the whole status thing further. This is a front-end class, okay? Yeah, but it's important you know what status is coming and you should be able to interpret them. Okay. All right, so let's carry on. So let's quickly create a dynamic route where we can manipulate our user information based on their IDs, right? So for that to happen, we would create inside our user route, we'll create a new file, and that file would be id.js. Okay. 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 Are we together? All right. So for this, we are still going to create a default handler, export default function handler request response. Okay. Now, for this handler, we want to query based on ID, right? So let's say const ID, and then request dot query. Okay. Now we can go ahead and define our different methods now. Okay. So we are looking to define three methods, basically. The first method will be to get if request to that method and method is equals to get. So for this, we want to get our users based on the IDs. So let's say const user should be equals to users dot find. So let's import our users, please, before we carry on. Users. So remember, we're importing users from our library, right? So users dot find, and then we want to say user dot ID. So we want to find user where user.id is equals to the ID that is being passed into our handlers. Okay. So once this user matches, once the user ID matches this ID that's been queried, that user should be returned. So in this case now we'll say if, so let's have an error handling first. If the user does not exist, return response dot status of 404. Then pass a message of error, user not found. Okay. User not found. Okay. Then in a case where it's successful, so that ID is being returned successful, you want to now return your response, the status of 200. Then you want to pass your user information. Okay. So now what happens here is when this is successful, the result should be only one user. The result should not bring two users, all the users like it did here. Remember that with this now, we are getting all the users. Now, but in this case now, we are getting the users based on the ID that we are going to be querying, okay? So if the user ID matches the ID that is being passed, we want to get only that user's information, right? Now, we are going to be using that for dynamic display of the user information, excuse me. All right, so let's go ahead and have a put request quickly. So let's say if request dot method. So that we can be fast with this, equals to it. So we want to request name and email. So you understand that put is to update, right? So request dot body, and then say if user is not available, we want to give the error of user not found, okay? Then if user is available, we want to update username with the name. So remember that we are getting the user using this method. Okay. So now we can update the name, and then we can also update the email. Then we can return response status of 200. Okay. Then pass the user. All right. We can close that. Now, you notice that we are defining all our methods within one handler, right? Like I said before. So we should have one more, then we should be good to go. So let's handle delete. So let's say if the method is delete, and the user matches the ID, we should be able to okay, so should be able to do index equals to -1, able to return res the status of 404. But JSON, and then give error message or not found. Okay. Yeah, we should be able to now users dot splice index 1. So let's return our response the status We'll say 204. Then, okay. Now remember that after creating this, you still want to add one exception at the end to make sure that you handle your 405, right? So return res dot status 405 dot end. Okay, let's go ahead and see how we can utilize this. Okay, so let's modify this. Hold on, guys. And so users rather index. Okay, index we users. Let's find index. All right, okay. Okay, I think this should work now. Yeah. Abiola, thank you. I've modified that. All right, so let's go ahead and test out our API. So now we have a delete method, a put method, and a get method created to manipulate our user array. And then we also have a get method and a post method to get our users and create users. So now let's go let's go right on to see what our application looks like right now. Okay, so for our get request, remember that we created an environment variable with this, right? So we are going to be accessing this base URL from our application from here. So remember that this route we just created is something similar to this type code JSON placeholder free API that was given to us, right? So, but in our case now, we've created our own API route. So in essence, we are going to remove this. First thing we want to do is we want to access the base URL, okay? So $sign. So in order to access the base URL, you want to process .env. And for that process, we want to access the next public base URL. Okay. Now that we've accessed that base URL, we want to now access our API. So say API slash users. As you can see here, you see that we have API, then we have users. So slash users. Okay. And then we have slash users. So if we save this now, we should be able to see our users in the console. So let's start up our server. That's 300, 3,000. Okay. All right. So let's increase this. All right. So if we go to our user page, so we have an error. users.map is not a function, so let's take out this for the moment. Okay, let's test out our code first. Make sure that everything is okay. All right, so we're getting user not found from our API, okay? So let's go ahead and see why we're getting that. Okay, so this is where we're. So let's rename this to users. And then let's go ahead and check again. Okay, so as you can see, we now have our users on the console, right? So this means our API is working perfectly. So we can display our users again. Okay. Let's say, then we can see our users. Okay. Now we cannot see details yet. We are going to do that. So, but as you can see, you can see the username and the email, right? From this API. So the API we are calling now is this get request, this route. We are calling this route and we are assessing it based on this get request. Okay. Now let's handle our post request too. Are we following it so far? Comments, please. Are we following it so far? Yeah, so it's just, so we're just utilizing the APIs. That's basically what we are doing, right? So you create your route and then you just utilize the route. It's the same thing as calling an API that someone has created. But what's happening here now is you are getting to understand what's happening on the back end, and then you are pretty much, it's easy to utilize these things on the front end when you understand what's happening on the back end, right? So, but yeah, you can always go back and watch the class. Yeah, definitely. Since because of time, we might not be able to take things over and over, and we might need to be a little bit fast. Okay. All right. Let's carry on. So now we have our get request working. We want to work out our post requests. Or for this case, let's just handle the edit and delete, and then we can move on. You can handle the post on your own. Okay. So let's go ahead and so within here, basically, you know that when we're working here, we created these users. So we want to have a situation where these users were able to have like an initial users. So let's convert these. Let's change this to initial users. So you can see that we're still passing the users data to these initial users, right? Just for clarity. And then so that we understand what we are doing better. So now that we have initial users, we want to create a state. So I want to say cost users and set users equals to use state. And for this use state, we want to have our initial users. Okay. No, don't need to know this. All right. So now that we have our initial users, we have our user state created, we can go ahead and handle updates. Okay. So for us to handle updates, we'll create a handler. First handle a function, handle updates equals to async. We want to do it based on the ID. So we want to say const prompt us to input our name. So let's just use a prompt. Prompt us to enter our name. So we enter new name, and then we can also const email, enter new email. Okay, so we're using prompts so that we don't waste time. And then, hold on. So let's have a field save and say if name or email. Okay, now we can go ahead and const response should be equals to await fetch from our API. Okay, so remember that we've created our API. So now which API are we calling from? We are calling from the dynamic route. Okay, so for us to call from that dynamic route, we will be utilizing, you say, call from our API /users/ID. Okay, so say $/ID, because now we are going to be picking the ID in order for us to handle these updates. Okay, now we will need to specify the method. And for the method, we want the method to be a put request since we are updating. Okay, a put request since we are updating. Then we also want to pass our headers, and our headers will be content type. So our content type should be application/JSON. Okay. Okay. Now that we have our method and headers defined, we want to pass our payload to the body. So for our payload, we are passing a JSON stringified version of our user, of our username and email. All right, are we following? Are we together, everyone? Now I want to handle our exceptions. So you say if the response, okay, then we want to const updated user equals to await. Where is the JSON? So I believe what I'm doing here is not strange. It should not be strange to you all. You guys have been making API calls throughout this program so far. So we are just handling our API call here. So we'll say previous. Okay, so previous.map user and user.id is equals to ID or updated user. Or user. Okay. All right. So with this, we can now have our failsafe when else alert should say that failed to update user. Okay. So if we trigger this update user now in our application, so let's come down here and create a button. Excuse me. And create a button and call it okay, and call it so we give an on click here, and for this on click we want to pass our handle update and utilize our user ID .id to handle that. Okay, so let's give a little styling to this. Right, 600. That's right. Okay, we can now call it delete update or say edit user. All right, let's see what this can do. Okay. So let's say we have an error. Use state is not defined. Okay. So we want to define our use state. What else? Okay. So we have our edit user. So if I click on edit user, we should have this pop-up to enter a name. So let's say David Edu. And if I click on OK, I should say where to have Dave at gmail.com. And once this is done, we should have, so we had failed to update user. And that should user not found. Okay. So let's see why the user was not found. So let's start this server again. Okay. And let's okay. With Edu. Gmail.com. Okay. All right. So API user /1 404 not found. Okay. So let's go ahead and see why we are having this issue. So we are calling this API without referencing the base URL. Are we together? So because we are not referencing the base URL, the URL is not being seen by the server side. Okay, so what we need to do now is open up that URL for the server side to see, and I believe we should be able to make that edit now. Okay, and then okay, so if I click on OK, so we still have the same issue. Hold on, guys. Let's see why we're having this issue. Yeah, I'm editing, not updating. So that's why we're using the put method. So basically it's not finding the user, but it's hitting the endpoint. So let's just debug that. Yeah, hold on. Go ahead.
Okay, sir. I'm not sure if I'm actually following, but let me just state what I understand. You want to edit David Edu, but David Edu is not in the API. It's not in the API you created.
It's not part of the
So
data.
how would you now edit it?
Yeah, so I'm not editing, I'm changing the name. I'm editing this user's
Oh,
information.
okay. You want to change the name.
Do you understand? So when you are editing, you are not like creating a new user, you are updating a particular information. So I'm updating
Okay.
this particular user's information, if that makes sense.
Oh, I get it now.
All right, okay. Yeah, yeah. So user not found. Okay. So let's work out our details page quickly. So I'll know if it is the particular route that is, if it's the whole route that has an issue. So in order to view our application, let's go ahead and work in our dynamic route. So remember that we are now we're exposing this route. Okay, so we're calling this route slash users. Okay, slash users. Okay, and then we'll update this to and we will utilize this here. Okay. All right. So if we save this, we should be able to view our users dynamically. Okay. So as you can see, the issue we're having is with the route generally. So let's see why we're having that issue. Okay. Hmm. Strange. Hold on, guys. Now we're actually passing it correctly. Our users ID. Okay. And for users, static, await search, blah blah. Okay. ID. That's true. I think we're get there's something wrong. I'm not seeing it at the moment because we're assessing the correct routes here based off our setup. So we seem to be having an issue with our dynamic routing. So you're getting the parts here. The difference between the static part and static props is you're getting the static props here. So here you're getting the props from which is the params, these props that we've defined here. And then for this, you're getting the static part. That is your URL, static URL, if you call it that. Is that clear, Abiola? Okay. But the API is expecting it in a JSON format. And that's why we're using a JSON format. User not find, user not ID, user not found. Yes, it's not going to make a difference. Okay, so I think this would require further debugging because I still can't find this issue. So one thing you should understand is that it's possible that it's a very minor issue, but it's not something I can see at the moment. So for that, maybe we can let's try the delete. Let's see if delete works, okay? Okay, that's actually a good point. That user hasn't gotten there. But this can be problematic, but let's try it and see if it works. So now let's try it for get. Okay, so seems to have worked. So I think what we need to do is ID. So I don't want us to handle this inside the API, so let's revert this. Let's rather use it here. Let's see what happens. Oh, I don't think it's gonna make any difference anyways. All right, so let's use this. This works. So let's try to edit again. Mr. David Edu, Dave at gmail.com. Okay, so apparently the issue we're having is a mismatch of IDs when trying to create and when trying to access. Uh, that's not the best solution. So what's going to happen is that you guys can go ahead and look at, I know you watch the class again, go ahead and look at how to pass that ID without using two equals signs, right? To avoid tag coercion. Okay. So I think we can try out delete. So let's go here. So this is a view more. So let's create a handle delete function, okay? Now for this handle delete function, we are going to say equals to async ID confirm delete. And for confirm delete, we want to use a confirm to say, are you sure you want to delete this user? Okay. So we say if you don't confirm, you should return nothing. But if you confirm, you should go ahead and delete the user. So let's just pick this. Okay. And then define the method. And the method should be delete. All right. And go ahead and say if else dot okay. I want to set user brief. I want to remove that user, right? So say filter user. Remove the user that has the ID that was passed. Okay. Then I want to say else. Give us an alert stating that we failed to delete user. Okay. So if we pass this handle delete, let's just utilize that same, let's use this button, okay? Let's call it delete user. All right, so if we come here, we should have delete user here. If we click on delete user, we should get a prompt that is requesting if we really want to delete that user. And if we click on OK, so it happened again. So let's do the same for delete user. Okay, and then OK. And says user not found. So we are not getting this. So let's go back here and okay. Okay. So yeah, so we did not expose our base URL to that API call. All right, so if we delete a username, should work. All right, as you can see, we can now delete, but it's not smooth because for some reason it's not auto updating. That's something people can fix on your own. Okay. All right, so we can see how to handle all the code functionalities using creating our own API and utilizing it in our application. It can be quite stressful since you now have to uh, build out your APIs and also build out your front end. It can be stressful, but it can also be rewarding because now you have everything in one place, right? So you don't necessarily need to create a backend, a different backend code base. You have all your code base in one particular uh, place, right? Uh, Definitely, this you when utilize when building production applications, you won't necessarily be using your own default data like we did here. You'll probably be connecting to a database, an external database, so that you can persist your information on your data, right? So probably because of time, we'll handle the next we'll handle how to work with this in the app structure in our next class. All right. Are we together? Yeah, go ahead, please. Ask your question.
Okay, so sorry, I wanted to know when are we to use the app method and the page method? Like in what scenarios there be let's say this
Already,
is this is the
yeah,
only method.
I answered that question before.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Uh,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear when you talked about it.
Hold on. Sorry, please. Let me take this. Just give me a second, please. Okay, sorry, guys. So yeah, so basically, one is legacy. So one is newer and the other is legacy. So if you are creating a new application, it's advisable you just go ahead and utilize the most recent NextJs method for handling things, which is the app method. And then yeah, for the page method, you might just encounter it in scenarios where you're working where they have a legacy code base that was created using the pages. So why we are doing both is so that if you find yourself in any of those scenarios, you can still thrive. Is that clear? Are we good? All right, okay. All right, thank you everyone for joining today's class. Okay, one more question. All right, go ahead.
Good day, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. When is it ideal to use get static props and get static parts?
No, it's not about being ideal. It depends on what you're using. If you're using a page, if you're using a pages method, you
Okay.
definitely will use get static props.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily need get static props when working with the app. But we'll look at it deeper when we are doing server-side rendering, possibly. Okay.
Okay, sir.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining today's class. See you in our next class. I think that's tomorrow, right? Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Sir.